Well, we're going to do kind of an impromptu Cloud Interrupted here today, and we thought it would be appropriate to chat a little bit about what's going on in the news. And that word is ransomware. We've seen it hit a oil pipeline and now some meat giant. And I think I even saw something about a police and some other things being hit by ransomware. And it seems to be, maybe it's just the news cycle, but we're sure seeing a rash of them lately. And frankly, we've had a couple people contact us lately with some concerns on how to avoid this type of thing. So it's top of mind right now. So we thought we'd jump on a call and chat about this and what people could possibly do to prevent this or recover from it.
Well, I mean, and I'm gonna jump first, but I'm gonna let Clifton talk about it because he's way smarter than I am. But I mean, there's two parts to it, and there's actually, I'll take it back. There's three parts to it, and I'm just gonna kind of say what the three parts are that I see. It's perimeter protection. You know, you have to have that, your endpoints and your firewalls and your networks and everything like that. They have to be able to protect against that. The second one is social. A social aspect of it. You have to be able to know that your people, when they see an email, they don't just click on some random button. You know, they should know that they're getting emails from Amazon or not. That's the one I see most often. And then the third part of it, and this is probably the part I see the most often, is you have to have a recovery plan. And most companies have kind of come at it, for as long as I've seen it, as they assume it's not going to happen to them because it's happening to companies that are way bigger than them. And I talked with a friend of mine who works, a former high school classmate of mine who now works in the FBI. And he said something to the effect of, for every one you hear about in the news, there's 20 that are not happening that you don't hear about in the news. So you're really only hearing about 5%. And that's a scary number when it's all said and done. And I think that's kind of the way that you have to have those three. And, you know, Clifton, I'm going to kind of defer to you. How would you say, when you're looking at it, what the back end, like, how do you handle that perimeter protection part of it?
Yeah, there's a lot of capabilities, a lot of tool sets. More so than just saying that, hey, here's a product, we're going to just throw this product at it. Mm-hmm. I think it starts with exactly what you said, and that's an awareness from a company perspective, right? Of changing mm-hmm. the dynamic of the company, starting with senior leadership on down, right? Of overcoming that unwillingness to change or unwillingness to accept that, hey, this can happen to us, right? Maybe we're not a Sony, maybe we're not some of these other large entities that have been in the news that have been attacked or compromised. But that doesn't mean that you're not of value, and that doesn't mean that you don't have assets. If you're a company and you're doing any type of success, right, you have assets that other people want, right? And so there's different ways for them to achieve that or to gain access to that. So I think it starts from a top-down approach, right? Getting the key stakeholders involved and building out that security business plan, or that security plan to be able to, where do we feel like we need to safeguard? Where do we feel like we can? What are the easy wins within the company to accomplish that, and then start building that up? I think it's also really important. For me, I think some of the easy wins in accomplishing that is removing local access for users, right? Almost every company that I come across, that's one of the number one vulnerabilities I see within a company, right? And many times it comes down to just they don't have necessarily the IT staff to be able to support that many users within their company. And so unfortunately, they end up having to grant additional access that maybe they don't want to users, so that users can provide that to them. Or maybe it's because they don't necessarily have the infrastructure or the technology to be able to support users that are remote, right? So being able to, how do we support somebody on the road needs the ability to be able to install software, but we don't necessarily want to grant them that by default because of, we're afraid of what the vulnerability is. So I think things are going to get by, things are going to, get past spam filters, things are going to get in through email systems. That's a big hole within most companies, right? You can teach users how to identify that. But I mean, there's been times where I've not necessarily, clicked on things, but I've certainly looked at something and had to reread it and reread it and reread it to find the vulnerability in it, right? Because it looks so official, right? And so I think by nature, that's one of the easy wins, I think, for a lot of companies is removing that access, and how do you accomplish that, right? I think also protecting your high profile targets, right? There's targeted phishing attacks. I mean, that information is publicly available for a lot of hackers. And so it's very easy for them to be able to, compromise those individuals. And unfortunately, those are the users many times that are unwilling to adhere to the security guidelines within the company, right? We'll remove local admin rights for all the other users except for these executives within the company. And unfortunately, those become sometimes the easy targets. And so I think those are honestly the biggest wins. And there's tools, there's methods to be able to, again, accomplish the administration and the IT support for those users, even if after removing those permissions. And then I think the next step for me, I see it as an easy win many times, is administrators, right? Administrators who don't realize how vulnerable they really are. For example, I think one of the biggest easy ways for the most common one I've seen many times that gets used is, a user inadvertently clicks on an email. They potentially have, admin rights on their machine. The vulnerability of malware gets, installed, or that becomes a launching pad for, the outside attacker at that point, because, they're able to get onto that computer. And then, unfortunately, administrators who have a single admin account, who have logged onto that computer, right? They've cached their credentials on that computer because they've, provided support to that user in the past. And unfortunately, that admin account is also a domain administrator. It's also an administrator who has access to their domain controllers, who has access to all the servers within their environment, right? And that, again, becomes a launching point for many attackers to be able to use to be able to infiltrate and consume or take over an entire network at that point, right? And start to, hit the sweet spot. So being able to offload that, going with like a multi-tiered administration model, right? Being able to separate out, admin roles within a company, and all these things really that, I've even addressed at this point, right? All these things are just security principles and guidelines, right? These aren't even necessarily tools involved at this point, right? There's a lot of tools that can come in alongside and help with this, right? But even up to this point that I've, even addressed, really all this is just principles, guidelines, standards for companies to build and build security principles around. So, Aaron, did you want to elaborate on that, or?
Yeah, no, I think we get so, I'm going to say I'm as guilty as the next person when it comes to finding the next great tool, and especially, and I think it's inherent in IT. But you mentioned it's principle. It's like principle of least privilege. It's principle of defense in depth. It's understanding that you should do vulnerability assessments on a regular basis. No code is perfect on day one. Otherwise, my toaster would also make coffee and give me a massage or shave my head for me. It'd be the perfect piece of software, but no code is perfect on day one. And you have to. It's a principle-based approach, which is principle of least privilege, leveraging something like privileged identity management, principle of access, privileged access management, understanding how do I build depth between my standard desktop user and the ability to completely compromise my core functional data set. Colonial Pipeline, I'm going to use them as an example. It didn't stop oil and gas from flowing through that pipeline. They could still have done that. But what they couldn't have done is measured and accounted for anything that exited the pipeline, anything that entered into the pipeline. So because that was what the software hit, the ransomware hit, was the ability to measure what was going in and out of the pipeline, at least from what I'm reading. I have to say I don't know specifics on that, but from what I'm reading, it wasn't going to stop the thing from doing. Same thing with the meat producer here in the U.S. it wasn't going to stop the cows from growing or the butcher, the slaughterhouses from working. But what it did do is it removed any ability to account for ABC 123. And that's where IT has to take the leadership and say, we need to plan. We need to plan for if this happens. You also have to plan, and you have to assume that you're a target, whether you know it or not. We're a smaller size consulting company. On our company firewalls at our office, 3 times a week, I see, spread-based attacks from a variety of sources, all hitting that IP address with a collection of vulnerability scans all at one time. And I'm not running it, and I know darn near everyone in the company isn't running it, so someone is, and they're trying to find some place with a vulnerability that they can compromise. Again, typical in typical IT, we find a tool and think it's going to be the end-all be-all greatest thing. And if you have a hammer, not everything's a nail. It's Maslow's principle, one of Maslow's principles, hierarchy principles. Not everything's a nail if you have a hammer. Sometimes you have a glass window and a hammer doesn't work too well with it. And you need to be able to build that tool chest, but you also have to know how to use them. And I think that's really where I come back at it and I look at it. For me, it's all about understanding and planning. It's proper planning prevents poor performance. That you learn when you're in the military, and you learn from project managers, you learn anywhere. Proper planning prevents poor performance. That's a thing that you have to know. You plan for it, and that way when it does happen, you're not worried. You're like, we got a plan. This is what we're going to do. It goes back to the idea that if you've seen something, you're way less likely to overreact. You're going to take the action necessary, and you're going to go from that point forward versus yell and scream and holler and then try and figure out, oh my gosh, what are we going to do?
Well, I think one of the things that makes this newsworthy is that you're dealing with such large companies that you'd think that they would have done that level of planning and would be able to recover, but then they're forced to pay the ransomware.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm going to stay back from the politics of paying ransomware or not, because there's some political conversations that have to be had on that as well. This is terrorism. I mean, let's just call it what it is. This is cyber terrorism in some way, shape, or form. They're taking and targeting, fire and healthcare organizations. They're targeting fire and police. They're targeting oil and gas pipelines, food manufacturers. This is cyber terrorism. How do you approach that? You have two choices, and you have competing interests. You have I'm going to say the national interest, which is we can't buckle to that, and we have the stakeholder interest, and it's not just stockholders. It might be company employees. It might be anything. And we're in a situation where you have to decide which one is more important right now. And we're coming out of a pandemic where we've had a significant, we had a significant downturn in the economy. Now we have a significant upturn in the economy, just like they did 100 years ago in 1921. And here we are in 2021, experiencing almost exactly the same economic profile. And now the last thing you can do is be in a situation where you're offline and out of production for any period of time, because the mass or the scale at which we produce today versus the scale at which we produced 100 years ago is astronomically different. It's something like 80 times higher. I think I saw it's like 72 or 80 times more efficient than what we produced 100 years ago, which means where we are maybe producing butchering one cow in 100 years ago. Today we're doing 80 in the same interval of time, which, when you genuinely think about it, it's very, very, very significant impact to the organization or to the economy as a whole. So you have to decide what's more important, stockholder and stakeholder impact or national interest. And the government is for sure telling you that the national interest is more important. Don't pay the ransomware. Don't buckle to terrorists. Whatever. But as a small business, if I don't have the ability to produce my services or my goods, I have 20 employees that I have to put food on the table for. I have 40 customers that I have to service. That's actually way more impactful to me in the short term, or in the very, very short term. So I pay the ransom because that's what I have to do. Now, is it the right thing? That's a different conversation. I'm gonna punt that, and that's a political conversation that I'm not gonna jump into. But I think that's a huge challenge that companies, again, they have to have a plan for that. That says, if the ransomware is below X or above X, or ransom is, if they're demanding, we're going to pay it just to get it back, and accept that we're going to see 62% or 80% of the data coming back. Thankfully, I guess, we're seeing, the ransomware cyber terrorists are giving back the data, which is kind of crazy. They're like, here you go, you paid, here you go. That's maybe a little bit more, generates a little bit more possibility that you're going to actually pay, as they show and demonstrate that they're not in it for the data, they're just in it for the Bitcoin or the Ethereum, the whatever cyber, or whatever the cryptocurrency is du jour. So
Thank you for watching Stratum's Cloud Interrupted. If you like what you see, please subscribe, like, and share this video.